My mother saw me standing near the back of the chapel and stopped smiling. For 9 years, she had told everyone I left home because I was jealous of my younger sister. Now Brielle was about to marry Evan Whitaker, the man whose life she claimed to have saved. Mom walked toward me, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. "Why is this missing piece here?" she asked, as if I were an object someone had accidentally returned to the family photograph. Brielle laughed and told her fiancé not to worry. "That is Audrey. She always appears when someone else is getting attention." I had not come to steal a wedding. I had come because the Whitaker family had opened the insurance file from Evan's accident, and the full 911 recording contained a voice Brielle could not explain. I had listened to it myself. I had also found the message she sent after receiving the scholarship that should have been mine. Then a flower girl Evan went completely still. His face lost its color as he stared at the scar across my palm, then at the old red coat folded over my arm. Brielle grabbed his sleeve and told him I was lying. He pulled away, reached into his wedding jacket, and removed a small piece of red cloth he had planned to mention in his vows. "Shut up," he said when my sister tried to speak again. His eyes never left mine. "This woman is the person who saved my life." But proving who saved him was only the first truth. The second would explain why my parents destroyed my chance at college, and why Brielle had planned this romance before Evan ever learned her name. Stay with me as I tell you how my family erased me from the night that changed all our lives, and please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happened when the truth finally returned. 9 years earlier, I was 18, and sitting at our kitchen table, with an acceptance letter beneath both hands. The nursing program was 3 hours away, in a city where no one knew me as Janice Calloway's difficult older daughter or Brielle's serious sister. I had earned strong grades, worked weekends, and completed every volunteer hour the program recommended. My mother read the first paragraph, gave me a polite smile, and set the letter beside her coffee. "That is a long way from home." Dad asked what the deposit would cost. When I told him, he frowned as though I had named an impossible amount, even though I had heard him promise Brielle a car after graduation. I waited for congratulations, or even a question about the campus. Nothing came. Brielle wandered into the kitchen in her pajamas and skimmed the letter. At 16, she already knew how to turn any room toward herself. "So Audrey gets to leave, and I get stuck here?" Mom reached for her hand and assured her that no one was leaving her behind. The conversation ended there. I carried the letter to my evening shift and told myself my parents only needed time. It was the first future I had chosen, and I still believed hard work could make them see me. Rain began before my shift ended and became a solid gray wall by the time I drove home. Water rushed along the shoulder, and my headlights barely reached beyond the hood. Near a curve bordered by trees, a pair of taillights spun across the road. The car struck the guardrail, slid down the embankment, and slammed sideways into several young pines. I pulled over, switched on my hazard lights, and called 911 before I was fully out of my seat. The dispatcher asked for my location. I read the nearest road marker, described the car, and told her I could see one person inside. She warned me not to put myself in danger and asked what I could see. The driver's side was crushed against a tree. Through the shattered passenger window, I found a young man trapped behind the wheel, conscious but fading. Blood poured from a deep wound near his shoulder and soaked the front of his shirt. "My name is Audrey," I told him. "Help is coming. Keep looking at me." The passenger door would not open, so I pushed through the broken window. The dispatcher guided me through checking his breathing and warned me not to move his neck. I pressed my hand over the wound, but blood kept slipping between my fingers. I tore at the lower edge of my red coat. When the fabric would not give, I used a jagged strip of metal near the window frame to cut a triangular piece from the hem. The edge sliced my palm, but I folded the cloth and pressed it firmly against his shoulder. He whispered that it hurt. I told him I knew, but I had to keep the pressure there. His eyes started to close. Beyond the trees, 3 porch lights glowed through the rain. "Stay with me. Count the lights." He blinked toward them and managed to count the first 2. I kept him focused while telling the dispatcher that the bleeding had slowed, the steering column had him pinned, and I could smell fuel but saw no flames. Rescue crews were less than 6 minutes away. With my free hand, I called home. I told Dad there had been a crash near the old Miller property and asked him to bring blankets. Our house was only a few miles away. By the time my parents' SUV stopped above the embankment, I had been inside the wreck for more than 10 minutes. Brielle followed them down wearing Mom's raincoat and froze when she saw the blood. "My sister just arrived," I told the dispatcher. "My parents are here too." Dad moved Brielle back. Mom stayed near the road, waving at the approaching emergency lights. Neither of them came close enough to take over the pressure on Evan's wound. Firefighters reached us first. One climbed through the passenger side and replaced my hands with his own, while another helped me out. Only then did I notice the blood on my coat and the deep cut across my palm. After the crew freed Evan, they placed him in an ambulance. I tried to follow, but another paramedic stopped me and said I needed stitches. A separate unit took me to the nearest emergency room. Evan never saw my face clearly. The last thing he heard was my voice telling him to count. At the hospital, a nurse cleaned my hand and closed it with 8 stitches. When she asked whether I had medical training, I told her I had only taken a school first aid course. "You stayed calm, controlled the bleeding, and gave dispatch exactly what they needed," she said. "You did the right things." I should have felt proud. Instead, I kept watching the door, expecting my parents to arrive. They never did. My phone buzzed while the nurse wrapped my palm. On the television in the corner, Brielle stood beneath an umbrella beside our parents, holding the unused roll of emergency bandage Dad had brought from home. The caption beneath her read, "Teen hero saves young driver." A reporter asked what she had done. Brielle looked toward Mom before saying she had kept the driver awake until the ambulance arrived. Mom placed an arm around her shoulders. Audrey called because she panicked. Brielle was the one brave enough to go to the car. Dad nodded beside them. The nurse looked from Brielle's clean hands to the dried blood along my sleeve. "Is that your family?" I could not make myself answer. Mom picked me up after midnight. During the drive home, I asked her to call the reporter and correct the story. She kept her eyes on the road and said people remembered chaotic events differently. "There is a recording," I said. "The dispatcher heard everything. Do not turn this into a competition with your sister." Dad was waiting at the kitchen table when we arrived. My acceptance letter lay neatly in front of him. Brielle sat across from him, still wearing the careful expression she had used for the camera. I placed my bandaged hand on the table and told them to call the station. Mom closed the kitchen door, moved my college letter directly in front of me, and looked into my face. "Before you ruin your sister's future," she said, "we need to decide which one of your futures is worth paying for." Mom kept one hand on my acceptance letter and looked at the bandage around my palm as if my injury were another inconvenience I had brought home. "What exactly are you saying?" I asked. "I am saying Brielle has an opportunity now," she replied. "The school called while you were at the hospital. They want to nominate her for the Hometown Courage Scholarship." I stared at my sister. She lowered her eyes, but she did not look ashamed. The scholarship was private, funded by local businesses. The school planned to submit the news report, a letter from my parents, and a speech Brielle would give about courage under pressure. "You cannot let them submit a lie," I said. "I will speak to the committee myself." Mom's expression hardened. "And tell them your mother, father, sister, school, and local news station all lied? Do you understand what that would do to this family? It would correct what you did." Dad leaned forward. "The emergency record will show that you called 911. It will not prove you were the one inside that car." The dispatcher heard me talking to him. She heard me say Brielle had just arrived. "She heard a frightened girl on a telephone," he said. "That does not prove every claim you are making now." I looked at Brielle and waited for one honest sentence. She rubbed the edge of her sleeve between her fingers. I did go down there, she said. I was at the car when the ambulance came. You stood behind Dad. I was still there. Mom raised her hand before I could answer. She said the family had already been through enough, and that she would not allow me to destroy Brielle's future because I felt overlooked. Then she gave me the choice she had prepared. If I contacted the reporter, the school, or the scholarship committee, I would leave the house immediately and pay every college expense myself. If I stayed quiet until the attention faded, she and Dad would consider helping with my tuition. The word consider frightened me more than a direct refusal. My program deposit was due in less than 2 weeks. I had saved some money from work, but not enough for the deposit, housing, books, and the first semester. My parents knew how close the deadline was. You are asking me to sell the truth for a promise, I said. We are asking you to think about someone besides yourself, Mom replied. During the next several days, our house filled with flowers, phone calls, and congratulations addressed to Brielle. Mom printed the article and placed it on the refrigerator, covering part of my college acceptance letter. The scholarship committee trusted the story that reached them first. They had a newspaper article, a school nomination, and 2 parents willing to repeat the same version. I told myself I was only waiting until my tuition was secure. Once I moved away, I could request the record and correct everything without risking the roof over my head. Brielle came into my bedroom 4 nights before her scholarship interview. She carried a yellow legal pad and closed the door. Mom said I should make sure I do not get the details wrong, she said. They might ask questions. You were there. Tell them what you remember. Her mouth tightened. It was raining. The car was in the trees. There was blood. That is all you remember because that is all you saw. She sat on the edge of my desk. If I freeze during the interview, people will start asking questions. Then Mom and Dad will blame you anyway. She asked how Evan had been trapped, where the blood came from, what I used against his wound, and what the car smelled like. She wanted to know what I said when he began losing consciousness. I should have sent her out. Instead, I thought about the tuition deadline and answered briefly. I told her the steering column had pinned him, and the car smelled like gasoline and wet fabric. When she asked how I kept him awake, I said I made him count the porch lights beyond the trees. She wrote down every word. Exactly what did you say? I looked at the bandage on my palm. Stay with me. Count the lights. Brielle repeated the sentence softly, changing her tone until it sounded calm. I understood then that she was not trying to avoid a mistake. She was learning my memory well enough to wear it. At the interview, she described the smell of gasoline. She said she had pressed red cloth against Evan's shoulder and made him count 3 distant lights. Mom sat in the front row with tears in her eyes. Dad stood when the committee announced that Brielle had won. The award covered a future year of tuition and included invitations to speak at community events. Everyone applauded while I stood near the back with my injured hand hidden inside my coat pocket. Afterward, Mom whispered that I had done the right thing for the family. She promised we would discuss my college payment the next evening. When that evening came, Dad placed my tuition statement on the kitchen table. The deposit was due the following morning. We have decided not to pay it, he said. I offered to work more hours. I said I could cover books and part of the housing if they handled the deposit. Mom shook her head before I finished. You have always wanted to be independent, she said. This is your chance to prove you can be. I never said I wanted to lose my place in the program. College will still exist next year. Then Brielle entered holding a brochure from a private university she hoped to attend after high school. Mom told her they would make sure she could focus completely on her education. They would cover tuition, an apartment, a dependable car, and her living expenses. The scholarship money would be hers to save or use for other opportunities. I looked from the brochure to my unpaid deposit. You just said helping me would prevent me from becoming independent. You and Brielle have different needs, Mom replied. Dad said I was practical and strong. Brielle needed stability because the rescue story could open important doors. He spoke as though my ability to survive disappointment made it reasonable to keep causing it. I reminded them that they had promised to consider helping if I stayed silent. Mom said they had considered it. Dad said the decision was final. The admissions office could not extend my deadline because the program had a waiting list. At noon the next day, my seat went to someone else. I did not cry until I began packing. I placed my acceptance letter, the emergency room record showing 8 stitches, and the newspaper clipping inside a cardboard box. Then I folded the red coat over them. The lower hem was torn into an uneven triangle, and dark stains remained near the sleeve. I kept it because it was the only thing in that house that did not ask me to doubt myself. It reminded me that I had been frightened, and still known what to do. The coat was proof that I had not imagined the person I wanted to become. I packed 2 bags and carried the box to my car. A coworker had offered me a temporary room while I figured out what came next. My parents did not help me load anything. Brielle followed me onto the porch. "I did not take your college money," she said. "I only accepted the opportunity Mom and Dad gave me. You accepted my actions, my words, and my future." Her face tightened. "Maybe I needed this more than you did. You always find a way." I left before she could turn that sentence into another compliment about my strength. 3 days later, while filling out community college forms and looking for a second job, Brielle sent me a photograph. She stood between our parents holding the scholarship certificate beneath a banner about courage. Under the photograph she had written, "Thank you for understanding that I needed this story more than you did." I took a screenshot before she deleted the message. I saved Brielle's message in 3 places before putting my phone face down. The words did not change no matter how many times I read them. She needed my story more than I did. In my family, that was apparently enough to make it hers. The room my coworker lent me was barely wide enough for a twin bed and a folding chair. I worked nights at a 24-hour diner, slept in the late morning, and spent my afternoons filling out financial aid forms. The nursing program I had lost was no longer an option, but the community college offered an emergency medical technician course I could begin within weeks. The tuition was low enough to cover with my savings and an installment plan. I enrolled before fear could talk me out of it. Marla Ruiz taught our first rescue simulation. She was a paramedic with silver beginning to show at her temples and a voice that could quiet an entire room without becoming loud. Our assignment was to assess a driver trapped after a collision while classmates shouted distractions around us. My partner froze when the training mannequin began releasing artificial blood. I secured the scene, asked him to call for additional support, and spoke to the mannequin as though a frightened person could hear me. Marla stopped the exercise and asked where I had learned to organize information under pressure. "I was in a crash scene once," I said. "Were you the patient?" "No. I was the first person there." She studied the fading scar across my palm, but did not press for details. After class, she told me calmness could be taught, but mine had already been tested. She warned me that instinct was not enough. If I wanted to work in emergency medicine, I needed discipline, repetition, and the humility to follow procedure even when I thought I knew what came next. For the first time since leaving home, someone described my strength without using it as an excuse to deny me help. I completed the EMT certificate while still working at the diner. On graduation day, Marla stood beside me for a photograph and handed me my first identification card. My parents did not know about the ceremony. I had stopped sending them news they could either ignore or hand to Brielle. The work was demanding and rarely dramatic in the way television made it look. I helped older people who had fallen beside their beds, children struggling to breathe, drivers shaking after minor collisions, and families having the worst morning of their lives. Most emergencies did not end with applause. They ended with paperwork, cleaning equipment, and hoping the patient reached the next level of care in time. That reality suited me. The work mattered even when nobody knew my name. I took prerequisite classes one at a time and entered paramedic training after several years in the field. Some weeks I studied between calls. Other weeks I slept in my uniform because changing clothes felt like a luxury. Marla became my supervisor, then my mentor, though she never tried to replace the family I had lost. She expected more from me whenever she knew I could give it. The second major turning point came when I earned my paramedic license. I held the card in my hand longer than I had held my original college acceptance letter. It did not erase the program my parents had taken from me, but it proved they had not been able to remove me from the work itself. The third came after a collision involving 6 vehicles on an icy highway. I was not the most senior person at the scene, but I created a clear triage pattern, kept 2 new EMTs focused, and caught a hidden breathing problem before a patient deteriorated. Afterward, the service director asked me to help train new employees. I almost refused. For years, I had believed competence meant working quietly and asking for nothing. Marla reminded me that teaching was not vanity. It was another way to keep people alive. By then, the redcoat had followed me through 4 apartments. I kept it folded in a box with my old acceptance letter and my first EMT card. I never treated it as courtroom evidence or imagined it would prove anything to anyone else. The torn hem reminded me that my ability had existed before a certificate, a uniform, or anyone's approval. On difficult nights, that was enough. Brielle's life grew in a different direction. My parents paid for her university, apartment, car, and every opportunity they said would have ruined my independence. She gave speeches about courage at school assemblies and charity lunches. The local article became a regional feature, then an introduction repeated whenever she appeared on stage. I saw the stories, because relatives shared them online. Sometimes Brielle stood beside a photograph of the wreck. Sometimes she spoke about the mysterious young man she had saved and how that night had given her a purpose. I had the screenshot of her message. I had my emergency room record and the coat. I also had rent, tuition payments, rotating shifts, and no money for a lawyer. By then, Brielle's story had been repeated so often that contradicting it would make me look like the bitter older sister my parents had already described. There was another reason I stayed silent. Brielle joined the Road Light Foundation, a traffic safety organization supported by the Whitaker family. Road Light funded driver education, emergency equipment, and support for crash survivors. Its work helped real people. I did not want a public fight with my sister to damage programs that had nothing to do with what she had stolen from me. Silence was not forgiveness. It was the decision I knew how to survive at the time. 2 years before Brielle's wedding, Road Light published a photograph of her beside Evan Whitaker. I recognized his name from the old article. He had recovered from the crash, completed years of rehabilitation, and later joined his family's foundation. The caption said he had finally met the girl who saved his life. According to the article, Brielle had volunteered at a Road Light event and mentioned details only the rescuer could have known. She described the gasoline smell, the red cloth pressed against his shoulder, the lights beyond the trees, and the words that kept him conscious. Evan had spent years remembering only fragments: a calm female voice, pain in his shoulder, rain on broken glass, and something red near his face. He believed her because every detail fit. They began dating soon afterward. Their engagement announcement described the relationship as a second miracle born from the same night. Brielle became one of Road Light's public representatives, and the story of rescuer and survivor appeared in fundraising materials, interviews, and event programs. I closed each article without commenting. What neither Brielle nor my parents knew was that the original record had not disappeared. After the accident, the Whitaker family's insurance attorney had obtained the 911 recording, dispatch report, and Evan's personal effects for the injury claim. A nurse had placed the bloodstained piece of red cloth in his belongings after replacing it with a sterile dressing. Evan later kept it as the only physical connection to the stranger he believed had saved him. Years afterward, he authorized his mother, Margaret Whitaker, to open that archived file while she prepared a video for his wedding. She expected to find a short call, perhaps a few words she could place beneath photographs of Brielle and Evan. Instead, she heard my voice giving the location, describing the bleeding, and telling the dispatcher what I was doing inside the wreck. Then she heard the sentence that broke the story apart. My sister just arrived. I knew none of that when I finished a late training shift and found an unfamiliar name in my inbox. My life was steady by then. I had work I respected, people who trusted me, and a past sealed inside a cardboard box at the back of my closet. Margaret Whitaker's email contained only one question. Are you Audrey Calloway, the woman who called 911 and kept my son alive 9 years ago? I read Margaret Whitaker's question 3 times before answering. For 9 years, my family had treated the accident as something I had either misunderstood or exaggerated. Now the mother of the man in that car was asking whether I had been the one keeping him alive. I did not say yes immediately. I asked where she had found my name, who had given her the recording, and whether Evan knew she was contacting me. I also told her I would not discuss the accident until I understood how the file had been obtained. Her reply arrived 10 minutes later. She explained that after the crash, the Whitaker family's insurance attorney had requested the dispatch recording, incident report, and related documents for Evan's injury claim. The attorney had kept a certified copy with the case file. Evan had recently authorized Margaret to review those materials while preparing a short video for the wedding. Margaret included the attorney's name and offered to arrange a call with all 3 of us. She did not ask me to trust her. She gave me a way to verify her story, and that mattered. The next afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook while Margaret and the Whitaker attorney joined the call. He explained when the recording had been obtained, how it had remained in the insurance archive, and why Evan still had the right to use it. His explanation was plain enough that I did not need to understand every legal term. Before he played the file, I asked whether Evan had heard it. Margaret said no. She had stopped after recognizing that the public story did not match the call. She wanted to confirm the facts before placing anything in front of her son days before his wedding. The attorney started the recording. Rain struck the road hard enough to blur the first few seconds. Then I heard my 18-year-old voice give the location of the wreck. It sounded younger than I remembered, but it was steady. I described the crushed driver's side, the wound near Evan's shoulder, and the pressure I was applying with red fabric. I closed my eyes as the younger version of myself seemed to return. The recording did not feel like a memory. It felt like opening a door and finding her still kneeling inside that car, waiting for someone to tell the truth about her. 11 minutes passed before tires and voices appeared in the background. Then my recorded voice said that my sister and parents had just arrived. A little later, I heard Mom speaking to someone near the dispatcher's open line. She was telling an emergency worker that Brielle had gone down to help. Her voice carried the same controlled certainty she had later used with the reporter and the scholarship committee. The attorney stopped the recording only after the ambulance arrived. No one spoke for several seconds. Margaret finally asked whether every voice and event sounded familiar. Yes, I said. But I need the full timeline, not only the audio. That evening, I built one myself. I wrote the time the call began at the top of a page. Beneath it, I marked each detail I had reported before my family reached the scene: the pinned steering column, the location of the bleeding, the smell inside the car, the red cloth, the lights through the trees. Brielle had later used every one of those details in interviews and speeches, but the recording proved I had already described them while she was still 11 minutes away. The timeline did not explain why my parents had chosen her. It did something more important first. It established what had happened before anyone had time to create a better story. I opened the storage box in my closet. The screenshot of Brielle's message was still backed up in my old email account. I found the emergency room record showing the time I arrived and the 8 stitches in my palm. Then, I searched through messages from the weeks after the crash and found an email I had nearly forgotten. Brielle had attached an early draft of her scholarship speech and asked me to correct the medical details because she was afraid the judges would notice a mistake. My reply contained several small edits, including the exact order in which I had controlled the bleeding and kept Evan awake. At 18, I had believed helping her make the speech accurate might keep my parents from taking away my education. 9 years later, the email showed how she had learned the story she claimed to remember. I sent copies of the timeline, the screenshot, the hospital record, and the email to Margaret and the attorney. I told them these were records I had preserved myself. I did not want anything added to the file that could not be explained clearly. Margaret called me that evening. "I am not asking you to forgive anyone," she said. "I need enough truth to make sure Evan knows what he is agreeing to before he marries your sister." I told her I did not want to walk into the chapel and humiliate Brielle in front of hundreds of people. I did not want cameras, a dramatic announcement, or revenge disguised as honesty. I wanted Evan told privately before the ceremony, with enough time to make his own decision, and Margaret agreed. After the call, I drove to Marla's house. She listened without interrupting while I explained the recording, the old email, and the wedding. "Why are you considering going?" she asked. "To correct what they stole. That is what happened. It is not yet your reason." I looked at the scar across my palm. Winning public credit would not return the nursing program, the years of extra shifts, or the family I had once believed I could earn by behaving well enough. "I do not want him to make a lifelong promise to someone who built their relationship on a lie," I said. Marla nodded. "Then remember that when they try to turn this into jealousy." When I returned home, I took the red coat from the box. I had once carried it to a trash bin after a difficult overnight shift. I had stood there holding the torn fabric before bringing it back upstairs. The coat was never meant to become perfect evidence. It had survived 4 apartments because it reminded me why I entered emergency medicine. On the night my family erased my name, I had still discovered the work I was capable of doing. I folded it carefully and placed it in a garment bag. Then I wrote Margaret that I would come to the city and meet Evan before the wedding. I asked her to keep the conversation limited to Evan, the attorney, and anyone necessary to confirm the records. Before she answered, another message appeared on my screen. It was from Mom. 9 years had passed since she had sent me anything that was not a holiday greeting forwarded to several relatives. Her message contained no apology and no question about my life. "I heard Margaret Whitaker contacted you. Do not bring up old misunderstandings during Brielle's wedding. She has worked too hard for this day." I understood immediately that Brielle had called her. I typed only one sentence. "I will only tell the truth." Mom began calling before I had set the phone down. I let it ring. Less than a minute later, Brielle's name appeared on the screen. I answered because I wanted to hear what frightened her most. She did not ask whether I was coming. She did not deny taking my story or explain why Margaret had found my voice in the recording. Her first words were, "Evan cannot see that red coat." Brielle's warning confirmed that she understood exactly what the coat could expose. I asked why Evan could not see it. There was a pause before she answered. "Because you will turn an old misunderstanding into a performance." I offered to speak with him privately. "You should not be speaking with him at all. He is marrying me." I reminded her that Margaret had already heard the recording. Brielle said recordings could be misunderstood, especially after 9 years, and accused Margaret of trying to control her son's wedding. Then she shifted to the argument my parents had used since I was 18. The accident had given her a purpose. Road Light had helped thousands of people. Telling the truth now would only destroy good work. "You could have done good work under your own name," I said. She ended the call without answering. The next morning, I drove into the city with the red coat folded inside a garment bag on the back seat. Margaret had arranged for me to meet her and the Whitaker family attorney at Road Light's administrative office, one day before the wedding. I had expected a small charity suite. Instead, the foundation occupied 2 floors of a renovated brick building near the river. Margaret met me in a private conference room. She looked tired, but she did not treat me like an enemy or a secret witness she needed to control. She introduced me to the attorney, then asked whether I wanted coffee, water, or a few minutes alone before we began. "I want to see everything in the order it was created," I said. The attorney opened the archived insurance file. We listened to the 911 recording again, while following the dispatch report line by line. The report showed when my call began, when fire and medical units were assigned, when my parents' vehicle arrived, and when the first responder reached Evan. Nothing in the dispatch record said Brielle had entered the car, controlled the bleeding, or spoken to Evan. Her name appeared only after I told the dispatcher my sister had arrived. A later note listed my parents and Brielle as people present near the scene, but it did not identify any of them as the person who had provided aid. The attorney explained that the absence of Brielle's name did not prove every detail by itself. It did, however, contradict the confident public claim that official records supported her story. "That is enough for now," I said. "I do not want anyone stretching the evidence simply because my family stretched it first." Margaret studied me for a moment. "You have spent 9 years expecting people to question you. I spent 9 years learning that a true story can still lose if the wrong person tells it first." After the meeting, Margaret offered to show me the road light offices while the attorney prepared copies I was permitted to keep. We crossed the lobby beneath photographs of crash survivors, school programs, and families holding donated safety equipment. I understood why Brielle had argued that exposing her would damage something good. Roadlight's work was real, even if the story she used to enter it was not. A large display stood near the main staircase. At the center was a photograph of Brielle and Evan beneath 3 glowing circles, designed to resemble distant lights. Across the top were the words, "Count the lights." I stopped walking. Margaret followed my gaze. "That is one of Brielle's campaigns." The display described how a teenage girl had guided a trapped driver through the darkest minutes of his life by asking him to count lights beyond the trees. The panels then connected that moment to Roadlight's mission of helping survivors find their way forward. The wording was polished, but the structure was familiar. It began with the smell of gasoline, moved to the red cloth, then ended with the same sentence Brielle had asked me to repeat while she wrote on a yellow legal pad. I stepped closer and read the campaign credit. Brielle was listed as the lead story strategist. "She did not only borrow the phrase," I said. "She built the campaign in the same order as her scholarship speech." Margaret asked whether I had ever seen the display online. I had, but photographs had made it look like another piece of wedding publicity. Standing in front of it, I remembered something more specific. When Brielle was finishing college, she had posted that a storytelling portfolio had secured her position at Roadlight. The post included a photograph of a binder with her name on the cover. At the time, I had scrolled past it because every achievement in her life seemed connected to the night I was trying to leave behind. I took out my phone and searched my saved family posts. The photograph was still there. "I am not asking anyone to open her personal computer," I told Margaret. "But if this campaign grew from the portfolio she submitted for employment, Roadlight may already own a lawful copy." Margaret did not touch my phone or make a promise. She called the Whitaker attorney back into the lobby and explained what I had noticed. He said the foundation could not search private files merely because Brielle's family story was disputed. However, the organization had the right to review material she had voluntarily submitted in her application and official campaign proposals if there was a legitimate concern involving donors, public statements, and organizational reputation. Margaret contacted Roadlight's executive director and head of human resources. Both were already aware that the wedding video had raised questions about the original rescue story. The review was limited to Brielle's employment portfolio, campaign records, and documents stored as organizational property. I waited in the conference room while they worked. I did not feel triumphant. Every new layer made the situation worse for Evan. Learning that the woman he planned to marry had taken credit for a rescue was painful enough. Discovering that their meeting might also have been engineered would alter the meaning of their entire relationship. Brielle sent 3 messages during that hour. First, she said she could meet after the rehearsal dinner. Then she changed the time to early the next morning. Finally, she wrote that no private discussion was necessary because Margaret was creating drama and Evan needed to remain focused on the ceremony. I replied that Evan deserved to hear the evidence before making his vows. She did not answer. Near sunset, the attorney returned, carrying a thin folder. The first pages were ordinary employment materials. Brielle had included writing samples, fundraising concepts, and a university communication project in the portfolio that helped secure her position. The project was titled Road Light Story Strategy: Reuniting a Survivor with His Rescuer. I read it slowly. It proposed identifying a crash survivor whose recovery had public recognition, arranging a filmed reunion with the person credited for saving him, and presenting the meeting as the beginning of a second life for both of them. The strategy recommended volunteer involvement before direct contact, a carefully controlled first interview, and a series of follow-up appearances that could build donor interest over time. It never said Brielle intended to marry Evan. The language was more cautious than that. One note suggested that if a close personal relationship developed, it could create lasting emotional value for future campaigns. Margaret sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly on the table. I compared the proposal with the public timeline. Brielle had joined a Road Light volunteer event shortly after an anniversary article about Evan's recovery. She had suggested a recorded reunion. She had arrived prepared with details from the accident. After they began dating, she helped turn their relationship into the Foundation's central story. Every step followed the strategy in the same order. I asked Margaret not to send the document to Evan by text or call him while he was surrounded by wedding guests. Brielle deserved one chance to explain it in a private room, and Evan deserved to see the evidence without being pushed toward a decision by an audience. Margaret agreed, but Brielle continued delaying the meeting. I returned to the first page and enlarged the document information attached to the official copy. The project had not been created after Brielle met Evan and adapted to fit their story. When I magnified the final line of metadata, I saw the date. It was exactly 6 months before Brielle's supposedly accidental meeting with Evan. The date on Brielle's project removed any possibility that the campaign had grown naturally from her relationship with Evan. She had designed a strategy around reuniting a crash survivor with his rescuer 6 months before she arranged to meet him. Margaret wanted to call Evan immediately, but I asked her to wait until we could speak face to face. A document could prove that Brielle had planned the encounter, but Evan still needed to hear the truth in a room where he could ask questions without wedding guests watching his reaction. The private meeting was scheduled for 7 the next morning, 3 hours before the ceremony. Brielle canceled it less than 20 minutes before it began. She claimed Evan had been kept awake by last-minute wedding problems and needed rest. Margaret tried to reach him directly, but Brielle had his phone while he met with a photographer. Gordon then called Margaret and warned that confronting Evan before the vows would create unnecessary confusion over a family dispute that had already been settled. By 9 o'clock, there was no longer enough time to arrange another meeting away from the venue. Margaret told me she would bring Evan into a private room as soon as he arrived at the chapel. I agreed to come only because every quiet option had been blocked. I dressed in a dark blue knee-length dress with a simple jacket. I tied my hair back and wore no jewelry except a small watch. The red coat remained folded inside a fabric garment bag, along with the copies of my emergency room record, the old email, and the timeline confirmed by the Whitaker attorney. I did not look like a woman arriving to challenge a bride. I looked like someone attending a difficult meeting. The chapel stood on a hill, above the river, surrounded by white flowers and strings of warm lights. Road light signs guided guests from the parking area toward the entrance. Even before I stepped inside, I could see that the wedding had been built around the rescue story. 3 circular lights hung above the altar. Programs on every chair described Brielle and Evan as 2 lives joined by courage. Near the guest book, a framed photograph showed Brielle pressing her head against Evan's shoulder beneath the words, "She kept him alive. He gave her a reason to believe in fate." A large screen beside the altar played a video without sound. Brielle appeared in several Road Light interviews, smiling while photographs of the damaged car faded behind her. Captions repeated the story she had told for years. She had found Evan trapped and bleeding. She had pressed red cloth against his wound. She had kept him conscious by telling him to count distant lights. My memories had become decorations. Margaret met me near a side corridor and said Evan had not yet arrived. His groomsmen were bringing him from the hotel, while Brielle was finishing photographs upstairs. Margaret wanted me to wait in the preparation room, but before we reached it, Mom stepped from the chapel. She wore a silver dress and the expression she usually saved for unexpected bills. Her eyes moved from my face to the garment bag in my hand. Then she raised her voice. "Why is this missing piece here?" Several guests turned toward us. Some were relatives I had not seen since leaving home. Others knew me only through the version of our family that Mom had repeated for 9 years. The phrase landed with 2 meanings. To Mom, I was the piece that had been removed from the family picture because I refused to fit where she placed me. To Evan, though she did not know it yet, the missing piece was a triangle of red fabric he had carried since the accident. "I was invited by Margaret," I said. Mom looked at her. "This is a wedding, not an investigation." Before Margaret could answer, Brielle appeared at the top of the stairs. She wore a white satin robe over her wedding dress, with her hair already pinned beneath the veil. Her face changed when she saw the garment bag, but she recovered quickly and smiled at the guests gathering nearby. "This is my older sister Audrey," she said. "She left home years ago because she had trouble accepting that our lives took different directions." Mom added that I had always competed with Brielle, even when no competition existed. Gordon entered through the chapel doors and walked straight toward me. He kept his voice low, but his words were clear enough for Margaret to hear. "You need to leave before you embarrass yourself and the family. I asked for 5 private minutes with Evan yesterday. You have had 9 years to move on." I did move on. That does not give Brielle the right to marry him, without telling him how their relationship began. Brielle descended the last few steps and stood between me and the chapel. "Evan knows everything that matters." "Then 5 minutes will not threaten anything." Her smile disappeared. She told Margaret that I had spent years twisting memories whenever Brielle received attention. She said I had become obsessed with proving that one night belonged to me, even though everyone at the scene remembered the same version. Margaret said quietly, "The recording does not." Several guests heard her. Brielle looked toward them before lowering her voice again. "That recording only proves Audrey called. It does not prove what she thinks it proves." I did not open the garment bag or take out the documents. The hallway was not the place to present evidence, and the guests were not a jury. I repeated that I wanted 5 minutes with Evan before the ceremony. Mom stepped closer. "You lost the right to interfere when you walked out of our home. You made silence the price of staying." A flower girl hurried around the corner carrying a basket in both hands. She looked about 6 years old and was watching Brielle instead of the floor. Her shoe caught beneath the edge of a runner, and she pitched forward beside the aisle. I dropped the garment bag and caught her beneath the arms before her face reached the stone floor. The basket overturned, scattering white petals around us. The child began crying. I checked her head, wrists, and knees before helping her sit upright. She was frightened, but not seriously hurt. "Look at me," I said. "Stay with me. Count the lights." I pointed toward the 3 glowing circles above the altar. Her breathing slowed as she counted them. The chapel entrance had become completely quiet. When I looked up, Evan Whitaker was standing just inside the doors. 2 groomsmen remained behind him, but he seemed unaware of them. He stared at me with the expression of someone hearing a voice inside a dream he had never been able to finish. Brielle moved toward him. "Evan, she is creating a scene." He did not look at her. "Say it again." I stood and helped the flower girl return to the woman waiting for her. Then I faced him. "Stay with me. Count the lights." His face lost its color. He crossed the chapel slowly, studying my eyes, as if trying to place them against shattered glass and rain. His gaze dropped when I reached for the garment bag. The scar across my right palm was pale now, but the line from the metal cut was still visible. "Which hand did you injure?" he asked. "My right." Brielle said anyone could have learned that from my family. Evan raised a hand without looking at her. "What else do you remember about me?" I could have repeated the details from the dispatch record, But I chose something that had never appeared in the article, the scholarship speech, or Road Light's campaign. "You wore a silver ring on your right hand," I said. "Your fingers began swelling, and you kept asking me to take it off. I could not move it over the knuckle, so I told the dispatcher the hospital might have to cut it." Evan looked at his right hand. A faint mark circled the base of his finger where the ring had once been. "The emergency room cut it off." Brielle stepped between us. "She has studied the accident for years. That does not mean she was inside the car. Mom said I had built my entire life around resentment." Gordon told Evan the family could explain everything after the honeymoon. Evan finally looked at Brielle. "Did you hurt your hand that night?" She hesitated. "There was so much happening." "Which hand?" "I do not remember." He turned to Margaret and asked whether the private room was available. Margaret said the attorney was already waiting there, with the archived file. Brielle caught Evan's sleeve. "We have guests seated. We can discuss this later." "No," he said. "We discuss it before I promise you the rest of my life." He asked Margaret, my parents, Brielle, and me to follow him. The Whitaker attorney joined us outside the preparation room while the wedding coordinator closed the chapel doors and asked the guests to remain seated. Inside, Evan locked the door and placed his phone face down on the table. The muffled wedding music continued through the wall. He looked directly at Brielle. "You have 5 minutes to explain why the sister you call a liar remembers things you never told me correctly." Evan's 5 minutes began, with Brielle insisting that the accident had been chaotic and that memory became unreliable after trauma. She said I had spent years filling gaps with details I wanted to believe. Janice immediately agreed. Gordon stood near the door with his arms folded, as if he were waiting for someone to end an uncomfortable family argument rather than a wedding built on fraud. I placed the garment bag on the table, but did not open it. "I will present everything in the order it happened," I said. "No interruptions, no accusations, and no one changes the subject. When I finish, Brielle can answer." Brielle gave a nervous laugh. "You do not get to control this room." Evan pulled out a chair and sat across from me. "She does for the next 5 minutes." Margaret sat beside her son. The Whitaker attorney opened the archived insurance file on his laptop and connected it to a speaker. He explained that the recording had been obtained during Evan's original injury claim and preserved with the dispatch report. It had not been downloaded recently or altered for the wedding. He pressed play. My 18-year-old voice filled the room. Rain hammered against metal while I gave the dispatcher the road marker and described the car against the trees. I reported that the driver was conscious, trapped behind the wheel, and bleeding heavily near his shoulder. Then came the sound of glass shifting as I entered through the passenger window. I heard myself tell Evan to keep his head still. I described cutting red fabric from my coat and pressing it over the wound. I warned the dispatcher that I smelled gasoline, then told her I could see no fire. Evan leaned forward with both hands clasped tightly in front of him. The recording reached the moment when his voice began fading. I told him to look through the trees and count the 3 porch lights. He counted the first one clearly. The second was barely audible. Several minutes later, I called home. Tires arrived in the background, followed by distant voices. My recorded voice said the sentence that had waited 9 years to be heard. "My sister just arrived. My parents are here too." Brielle stared at the speaker. The attorney paused the file and opened the dispatch timeline. My call had begun 11 minutes before the Calloway family vehicle reached the scene. By that point, I had already entered the car, controlled the bleeding, described Evan's condition, and kept him conscious. Brielle shook her head. "That proves Audrey was on the phone. I was the one who helped him when I arrived." I asked the attorney to continue. The recording captured me telling the dispatcher that emergency lights were approaching. A firefighter then took over the pressure on Evan's shoulder and helped me climb from the passenger side. No second civilian entered the car before the rescue team arrived. When the audio ended, the room remained silent. I placed my emergency room record beside the laptop. It listed the time I arrived at the hospital, the deep cut across my right palm, and the 8 stitches required to close it. Next came the email Brielle had sent before her scholarship interview. She had asked me how the driver was trapped, where the blood came from, what the car smelled like, and what words I had used to keep him awake. My reply contained the exact sequence she later repeated in speeches. Brielle's face reddened. I wanted to make sure the public story was medically accurate. You wanted details you had never witnessed. I was 16. Mom said the scholarship committee would humiliate me if I made a mistake. I placed a printed copy of her deleted message beside the email. The photograph showed Brielle holding the scholarship certificate between our smiling parents. Beneath it were her own words. Thank you for understanding that I needed this story more than you did. Evan read the sentence twice. You knew it was her story. Brielle's eyes filled with tears. I meant the scholarship. Audrey already had good grades and a plan. I had nothing that made people notice me. You had a family willing to pay for everything, I said. I was the one who lost my place in college. Janice moved closer to the table. This is becoming cruel. Brielle was a child under enormous pressure. I looked at her. She was a child when it began. She was an adult every time she repeated it afterward. Brielle wiped her cheeks and pointed toward the recording. Audrey called and entered the car first, but I still helped. Maybe she left before I reached Evan. The claim contradicted both the audio and the rescue timeline, but I did not argue. I asked her 3 questions. Which hand did you use to press the cloth against his shoulder? She looked down at her hands. My left. In her scholarship speech, she had claimed she used her right hand because she needed her left to hold Evan's head still. Which direction did the passenger door open? Toward the trees. The passenger door never opened. The frame was bent and I entered through the broken window. Brielle looked at Evan as if he might rescue her from the question she had once used to build their relationship. I asked the last one. What did Evan ask me to tell his mother? Brielle hesitated. That he loved her. Evan closed his eyes. He asked whether she would think he had been using his phone, I said. I told him his phone was still inside the closed center console. Evan looked toward Margaret. I was terrified she would think I caused the crash by texting. The police later confirmed the phone had not been used. Margaret's expression did not change, but the pain in her face deepened. This was no longer only about who deserved credit. Her son had shared his most vulnerable memory with a woman who had learned it from someone else. I unzipped the garment bag and placed the red coat on the table. The lower hem was missing an uneven triangular section. Dark marks remained near one sleeve, and the old stitching had begun to loosen along the cut. Evan reached inside his wedding jacket and removed a small, clear envelope. Inside was the faded piece of red cloth returned with his personal belongings after the hospital replaced it with a sterile dressing. He placed it near the torn hem. The fabric had changed with age and cleaning, but the color, thread pattern, and irregular edges corresponded. The narrow row of black stitching continued from the coat onto the smaller piece. This does not prove the case by itself, I said. Fabric can resemble other fabric. It only supports the recording, the timeline, my injury, the emails, and the details Brielle could not answer. Evan touched the plastic envelope, but did not remove the cloth. He looked at my scar, then at the coat, and finally at me. I remember your voice, he said. I remember you telling me not to move. I remember seeing blood on your hand when you reached across me. Brielle stepped toward him. She has been preparing this for years. She could have found a similar coat and created those messages because she hates me. Shut up. Evan's voice was quiet, but it stopped everyone. Brielle froze. He pointed toward the evidence on the table. This woman is the person who saved my life. Janice began speaking before Brielle could respond. She blamed the original article and said the reporter had misunderstood which daughter performed the rescue. According to her, the family had only repeated what the newspaper published because correcting it would have created more confusion. I turned toward her. A reporter can misunderstand once. Why did you repeat the same misunderstanding in the scholarship letter you signed? Why did Brielle repeat it in paid speeches? Her road light application, fundraising campaigns, and interviews for 9 years. Gordon lowered his eyes. Janice said nothing. Brielle began crying harder. She said she had been 16, frightened, and desperate for our parents' approval. She claimed Mom had pushed her in front of the reporter, and Dad had warned that correcting the story would ruin the family. Evan's expression softened for only a moment. "You were 16 when the accident happened," he said. "You were 23 when you met me." Brielle gripped the back of a chair. "That was different. Was our meeting actually accidental?" She looked at Margaret, then at me. Her fear changed into anger. "Yes," she said. "I volunteered at Road Light, and Evan happened to be there. I did not plan to meet him. I swear." I looked at Margaret. "Open the portfolio file," Road Light just confirmed. Margaret opened the file Road Light had recovered from Brielle's employment portfolio. The Whitaker attorney explained that the foundation owned the copy because Brielle had submitted it voluntarily as part of her application and later used portions of it in official campaign proposals. The first page showed the title, Road Light Story Strategy, Reuniting a Survivor with His Rescuer. The document had been created 6 months before Brielle claimed she happened to meet Evan at a volunteer event. Brielle looked at the date and shook her head. It was a college assignment. Students create imaginary campaigns all the time. I turned to the section describing how the campaign should begin. It recommended waiting for a newsworthy anniversary connected to a survivor, joining an organization associated with that person, and arranging a filmed reunion through a trusted contact. An anniversary article about Evan's recovery was published 3 weeks before you registered as a Road Light volunteer, I said. You asked to work at the exact event he was scheduled to attend. That proves I admired the foundation. I moved to the next page. The plan recommended approaching the survivor with details that would establish immediate emotional trust. Those details included a physical object from the rescue, words spoken during the emergency, and a memory unavailable in ordinary news coverage. You met Evan carrying the story about the red cloth and the 3 lights, I said. You knew those details because you asked me for them before your scholarship interview. Brielle folded her arms. I did not force him to believe me. No. You gave him the evidence he had spent years waiting to recognize. The final section proposed turning the reunion into a continuing public narrative. It suggested recorded interviews, anniversary appearances, donor events, and campaigns centered on the bond between survivor and rescuer. A handwritten note added that a close personal relationship could create lasting emotional value. Margaret placed copies of Brielle's Road Light work beside the project. The order matched almost exactly. She volunteered after the article, proposed the reunion, began appearing with Evan, then built the Count the Lights campaign after their relationship became public. Brielle looked at Evan. I did not know we would fall in love. He had remained seated throughout the presentation, but his expression had changed. The shock was gone. What remained was the careful distance I had seen patients use when they were trying to understand how badly they had been injured. Did you come to Road Light because of me? He asked. I came because I cared about the mission. That is not what I asked. Brielle wiped her face. I knew you might be there. Did you arrange our first meeting? She looked toward Mom, but Janice stared at the floor. Brielle finally nodded. The beginning was arranged. I thought meeting you would help my career and help Road Light. I did not expect what happened afterward. Evan asked whether she had loved him at all. Her answer came quickly. Yes. Maybe I planned how we met, but everything after that became real. Evan looked at the wedding ring, waiting in its open box on the table. You let me fall in love with the woman I believed had saved me. I became that woman for you. The sentence made Margaret inhale sharply. Brielle tried to correct herself. She said she meant that she had supported him, attended therapy events, helped him speak publicly, and stayed beside him whenever the crash memories returned. Evan's voice remained calm. Each time I thanked you for keeping me alive, you accepted it. Brielle began crying again. She said the lie had become too large to correct without destroying both families and damaging Road Light. She insisted that her work had raised money, funded safety programs and given survivors hope. Good results did not change how the relationship began. Even Gordon seemed unable to keep pretending otherwise. I knew she wanted to meet him, Dad said. Mom turned toward him. Gordon, stop. He looked older than he had when I entered the chapel. Brielle showed us the anniversary article and said the reunion could strengthen her position at Roadlight. I knew she planned to attend the event because Evan would be there. You told me it was fate, Evan said. Gordon lowered his eyes. I told myself that if you were both happy, the way it started no longer mattered. I had heard that reasoning my entire life. If the result benefited Brielle, the harm required to achieve it could be renamed, minimized, or forgotten. I looked at Janice. Was that also why you refused to pay for my college? She stiffened. This has nothing to do with your tuition. It has everything to do with it. You offered to reconsider the payment if I stayed quiet. After the scholarship was secured, you took the offer away. Mom said I had always been capable of supporting myself. She repeated that Brielle had needed more guidance and that parents sometimes had to make difficult choices between children with different needs. Did you refuse because you could not afford both of us? She did not answer. Did you have the money? Gordon sat down. Janice looked at him, but he did not rescue her. Yes, she said. We could have paid the deposit. The admission hurt more than I expected. I had known they chose Brielle, but some part of me had still believed money had limited their options. Then why did you stop me from going? Mom's composure finally cracked. Because you were entering a nursing program. You would have met instructors, doctors, and people who understood emergency procedures. Someone would have encouraged you to challenge the scholarship story. I stared at her. She continued before I could speak. Brielle's award had not been finalized when my deposit was due. If I moved away, gained access to legal advice, or contacted the committee, the nomination could collapse. The local article would be questioned, the school would withdraw its support, and Brielle would lose the opportunity my parents believed could define her future. So you made sure I had no school, no home, and no credibility. We believed you would wait a year. You told our relatives I left because I was jealous. Mom said they needed people to understand why I had disappeared before I started making accusations. Gordon admitted he had repeated that version because it was easier than explaining why their older daughter no longer spoke to them. They had not simply favored Brielle. They had made survival difficult enough to consume all my time. While I worked nights, searched for housing, and rebuilt my education one class at a time, they used my silence as proof that their story was true. My strength had not caused them to abandon me. They had relied on it. They believed I would remain too busy rescuing myself to expose what they had done. Brielle turned on me with sudden anger. This is what you wanted. You came here to take Evan because you cannot stand that I built a life from what happened. I do not want Evan. She laughed bitterly. Then why are you here on my wedding day? Because he deserves to know whose memories he is marrying. I do not want his money, your position, or the attention you received. I want you to stop using my name, my actions, and my voice to enter vows that depend on a lie. Efon stood. Everyone watched him, but he did not announce a decision. He asked us to remain in the room and told Margaret not to let anyone leave with the documents. Then he walked into the corridor alone. Through the wall, I heard the organist begin another song to calm the waiting guests. Brielle sat beneath her veil, staring at the closed door. Janice whispered that Evan only needed time, and that no man would cancel a wedding over something that happened 9 years earlier. Minutes passed before the door opened. Evan returned without looking at Brielle. He walked directly to the officiant, who had been waiting outside the room, and spoke clearly enough for all of us to hear. Please tell the guests there will be no marriage today. The officiant looked at Evan as though he had misheard him. Behind the chapel doors, the organ music continued, while more than 100 guests waited for a ceremony that would never begin. Evan repeated himself. Please tell them there will be no marriage today. Brielle rose so quickly that her chair struck the wall. You cannot make that decision while you are upset. I am making it because I finally have the truth. She reached for him, but he stepped back. Janice moved between them and asked Evan to consider the humiliation Brielle would face if he canceled the ceremony in front of everyone. Margaret's voice remained controlled. Your daughter's embarrassment is not more important than my son's right to know who he was marrying. Janice turned toward me. This is what Audrey wanted. She has been waiting 9 years to destroy her sister. I did not answer. Evan had already made his decision, and I would not allow Mom to turn it into another competition between her daughters. The officiant entered the chapel first. Evan followed him before anyone could stop him. Margaret asked the wedding coordinator to switch off the large screen and remove the programs that described Brielle as Evan's rescuer. Brielle hurried after him in her wedding dress. Janice and Gordon followed, leaving me beside Margaret and the attorney. You do not have to go in there, Margaret told me. If they speak about me, I need to hear it. We entered through the side door. The guests fell silent when they saw Evan standing alone at the front. Brielle stopped several feet behind him, her veil trembling against her shoulders. Evan thanked everyone for coming. He said he had learned information that changed his understanding of how his relationship began. He would not discuss every private detail in public, but continuing with the ceremony would mean making vows without honest consent. A murmur moved through the chapel. This wedding is canceled, he said. You respect the privacy of everyone involved while we determine what happened. Janice stood from the front row. Tell them who caused this. Gordon caught her wrist, but she pulled away. My older daughter arrived here because she has always been jealous of Brielle. She could not tolerate seeing her sister happy. Evan looked toward me at the side of the chapel. Every guest followed his gaze. Audrey did not come here to destroy my wedding, he said. My mother invited her after discovering evidence in the archived record of my accident. Janice tried to interrupt, but Evan continued. Audrey Calloway is the woman who called 911, entered my car, controlled my bleeding, and kept me conscious until rescue crews arrived. The Calloway family allowed another story to be repeated for 9 years. The room became so quiet that I heard one of the decorative lights clicking above the altar. Several relatives stared at my parents. Others looked toward the photographs of Brielle beside the wrecked car. The Road Light executive director walked to the display table and quietly instructed 2 staff members to remove the Count the Lights materials. Brielle crossed the aisle toward me. You took my wedding. Her makeup had begun to run, but her anger was stronger than her grief. I told Margaret I would meet Evan privately. You knew this would happen. I knew he deserved the truth before making a lifelong promise. You could have waited until tomorrow, after he married you? She said their relationship was real, regardless of how it had begun. She accused me of valuing one night more than the years she had spent supporting Evan and working for Road Light. I did not cancel your wedding, I said. Evan did after learning what you had hidden from him. You gave him the reason. A marriage built on informed consent should survive the truth. This one did not. Her face twisted. You could not stand that someone finally chose me. I cannot take a marriage that was never built on honest consent. Brielle lifted her hand as though she might strike me. Gordon stepped between us and guided her toward a side room. Janice followed, still insisting that everything could be repaired if people stopped listening to old recordings. Guests began leaving in small groups. Some approached Margaret to offer help. No one came near my parents. Gordon found me in the hallway 10 minutes later. He looked exhausted and kept glancing toward the room where Brielle was crying. We need to speak privately. I have heard enough private family explanations. This is about your future. He said he and Janice were willing to reimburse the college deposit they had refused to pay 9 years earlier. They would also cover tuition if I wanted another degree. In return, I only needed to tell Evan that the accident had been confusing and that Brielle had not deliberately deceived him. You admitted she planned the meeting. I said she hoped to meet him. That does not mean the relationship was false. You want me to lie again. I want you to recognize that Brielle could lose everything. I asked whether he had thought about what I might lose when he let my nursing place disappear. You recovered, he said. You built a career. The answer showed that he still believed surviving harm erased the person who caused it. Janice joined us and promised to make a public statement praising my emergency work. She said the family could describe the rescue as something both sisters had participated in. Brielle would keep her reputation, and I would finally receive recognition. Even now, she was trying to divide my actions into a version Brielle could continue using. Cha mer bao con tur lo chotung lai kwamin, I said, then repeated it in the language they had used throughout my childhood. You told me to take care of my own future. Today, I will let everyone take care of the consequences of their own choices. Janice's face hardened. You are punishing all of us because we made one mistake. One mistake does not require 9 years of speeches, campaigns, contracts, and lies. I walked away before she could rename it again. Near the preparation room, Evan removed the wedding ring from its box and handed it to Brielle. He told her the engagement was over and asked her to collect her belongings from the house he had prepared for their married life. She could arrange a time through his attorney, so neither of them had to be there together. Brielle asked whether he had ever loved her. I loved the person you allowed me to believe you were, he said. She looked toward me, but I did not step into the space between them. Evan was not a prize being transferred from one sister to another. He was a man ending a relationship because his consent had been built on false information. After Brielle left with our parents, Evan approached me. I am sorry, he said. I built part of my life around a story that belonged to you. You were lied to. I still benefited from it. I told him the truth did not make him responsible for what my family had done. What mattered now was what he chose to do with it. The Road Light executive director then informed us that Brielle was suspended from all public duties. The board would review the campaigns, paid appearances, donor materials, and employment documents connected to the rescue claim. The organization would not cancel programs helping crash survivors, but it would correct any public account built on false information. I gave the attorney permission to use my records for that limited review. I refused an immediate interview and asked Road Light not to release my workplace or personal contact information. By the time reporters began gathering near the front entrance, I had already left through the side parking lot. Marla was waiting beside her car. She did not ask whether I had won. She opened the passenger door and let me sit quietly until my hands stopped shaking. I did not feel triumphant. A wedding had collapsed. Evan had lost the future he expected, and my family had proven they would still bargain with the truth even after losing everything it had bought them. Yet, for the first time, the truth no longer lived alone inside an old box in my closet. That evening, Janice called 17 times. Her final message was not an apology. Brielle could lose everything. You are the only person who can still fix this. Janice's message stayed unanswered until the following morning. By then, she had sent me a plan. She wanted the 4 of us to appear together in a recorded interview and describe the rescue as a misunderstanding caused by panic, youth, and poor communication. Brielle would apologize for accepting too much credit. My parents would praise my work as a paramedic. In return, I was expected to say that no one had intentionally harmed me. It was the same bargain they had offered 9 years earlier. They would give me a small portion of the truth if I helped protect the larger lie. I declined in writing. I told my parents that I would not participate in an interview, private settlement, or statement designed to restore Brielle's image. Any future relationship with me could only be considered after they acknowledged what they had done without excuses. They would have to admit that I performed the rescue, that they pressured me into silence, and that they deliberately withdrew my college support to protect Brielle's scholarship. They also had to accept that an apology did not require forgiveness in return. Gordon replied that my conditions were harsh. Janice said I was trying to humiliate them. Neither of them disputed a single fact in my letter. I did not argue. I had spent enough of my life explaining pain to people who benefited from pretending not to understand it. Road Light began its review the following week. The organization removed Brielle's name and image from its public campaigns, canceled her speaking appearances, and announced that its account of Evan's rescue had relied on false information. The statement identified me as the original caller and first responder, but it did not publish my workplace or personal contact information. The foundation kept its driver education and survivor support programs. That mattered to me. Correcting Brielle's story did not require destroying useful work performed by people who had never known the truth. Brielle was dismissed from her public role after the board confirmed that she had submitted the rescue story in her employment portfolio and used it to obtain paid opportunities. Roadlight demanded repayment of fees connected directly to appearances in which she had described herself as Evan's rescuer. The private scholarship committee also revoked her award. Its attorneys sought repayment after reviewing the 911 timeline, her application, and the letters our parents had signed. There was no dramatic arrest, and no police officer waiting outside her door. Her punishment was more ordinary, and for her, more frightening. She lost the engagement, the career identity she had built, and the special story that had opened every room before she entered it. For the first time, Brielle had to introduce herself without telling people she had saved a life. Janice was asked to resign from the local charity committee, where she had often spoken about raising a courageous daughter. Gordon lost his seat in the business association after members learned he had signed a false letter supporting Brielle's scholarship application. Their house was not seized. They did not become homeless. They simply had to live in the same community after everyone understood the choice they had made between their daughters. That was enough. Several weeks after the canceled wedding, Evan asked to meet me at a cafe near the river. Margaret knew about the meeting, but she did not attend. We sat at a table near the front window, where neither of us could mistake the conversation for something secret or romantic. Evan placed the clear envelope containing the red cloth between us. "This belongs to you," he said. I looked at the faded fabric and the uneven black stitching. It had stayed with him through surgeries, rehabilitation, and years of believing the wrong woman had placed it against his wound. "You should keep it for now." He looked surprised. "It is part of what happened to you too," I said. "Keep it as a reminder that a beautiful story still needs to be checked before you build your life around it." He asked whether I hated him for believing Brielle. "No. She had details no stranger should have known. You trusted the person who appeared to fit your memories. I also liked the story. Most people would." He admitted that the idea of marrying the woman who saved him had made the accident feel meaningful. Losing that story left him unsure what the recovery meant now. I told him survival did not need a romance to justify it. He had lived, rebuilt his body, and used Roadlight to help other survivors. Those things remained real even though Brielle's role did not. Before we left, he thanked me for entering the car that night. I told him I was glad he had survived. We did not make plans to meet again. Months passed before I heard from him. By then, Roadlight had completed its corrections, and Evan had stepped away from public appearances to rebuild his life privately. A small package arrived at my apartment, with no personal message beyond one sentence. "I no longer need the cloth to remember the truth." I placed it inside the box with the red coat. My own life had continued while Many of those credits could be applied toward a bachelor's completion program in emergency services management. The program was designed for working professionals. I could study online, attend several weekend sessions each term, and continue training new EMTs. For years, I had treated higher education as a door that closed when I was 18. The advisor showed me that the original door was gone, but the future behind it was still reachable by another path. I enrolled. The work was not easy. I studied budgeting, emergency planning, staff leadership, and disaster response after long shifts. I completed assignments at my kitchen table, and sometimes fell asleep beside an open textbook. The difference was that exhaustion no longer felt like punishment. Each course belonged to a future I had chosen for myself. Marla reviewed my first leadership project and covered the margins with notes. My coworkers tested me before exams and brought food during final weeks. Several EMTs I had trained helped me prepare a presentation on preventing burnout among first responders. No one called me brave for doing it. They simply helped. 2 years later, I crossed a graduation stage wearing a dark gown over my dress. Marla sat in the front section beside my coworkers and 3 former trainees. They cheered loudly enough to make strangers smile. My parents were not there. Brielle was not there. For a moment, I noticed the empty seats, where I once would have imagined them sitting. Then Marla stood and lifted both hands above her head, and one of my trainees shouted my name. The empty seats no longer decided whether I belonged in the room. After graduation, I brought the red coat to a tailor and asked her to show me how to repair it myself. I took the piece Evan had returned and stitched it into the torn hem. The fabric no longer matched perfectly. The old section had faded differently, and the seam remained visible. I did not want it hidden. I framed the coat behind glass and hung it in the training room where I taught new EMTs. Beneath it, I placed a small card that said only, "Stay calm, tell the truth, help the person in front of you." Independence had never meant being abandoned and expected to feel grateful for surviving. It meant having the right to speak honestly, choose the people I called family, and build a future without purchasing anyone's love with my silence. 9 years earlier, they had taken my name out of a rescue story and closed the door to college in front of me. When I crossed the stage to receive my degree, I understood that they had only delayed that life. They had never owned it.